This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. Today, we face a different form of crisis, one with roots that extend far deeper and are likely to last far longer than COVID-19. This is a virus that affects all of us, a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. If allowed to flourish, these counterfeit truths will result in the collapse of public trust, and without trust, democracy as we know it will simply decline into irrelevance. Those are the words of Lord David Puttnam, the Oscar-winning film producer who gave us The Mission and Chariots of Fire, amongst many other films, and who has most recently chaired the House of Lords Select Committee on Democracy and Digital Technologies. Their report was published on the 29th of June, and David joins me today on the podcast to discuss it, along with our resident expert, the disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. David Puttnam, it's fantastic to have you on the Infotagion podcast. I've very much enjoyed reading the House of Lords report that your committee just published this week at the time we're talking, looking at the whole range of issues that affect democracies and societies in the digital age. And I think it's one of the things that's highlighted in your report, I think is absolutely right, is that, and why the report's so important, is that a lot of the laws that we've created over the years around campaign finance, transparency of communications for elections, they don't really apply in the internet age anymore. And yet, this is where people mostly go to get their news and information. It would seem, I think as you recommended, that first off, there needs to be a substantial modernisation of the laws we have in place to protect our democracy.
I think it's absolutely true. Damian, where we were lucky was we were able to ride the surf of the Law Commission's report. The Law Commission took 9 years looking at this and came to the conclusion that our electoral laws were hopelessly out of date. We also took excellent, I was very impressed, evidence from the Electoral Commission. They were terrific. So what was interesting was you kind of lined up a group of people who really had looked at this thing, and there was a total consistency of view. So I think, again, I say we were fortunate. We were almost the last in and able to ride the surf of a lot of other expertise.
And I think some of the key things I think seem to be that, for me, that firstly, the lack of transparency. There's no legal requirement to really demonstrate who you are if you're communicating and advertising on the internet. Whereas if you're putting up posters or putting leaflets through people's doors, then you do. You just have to be clear who you are. And that also affects the campaign finance laws too. I remember when I was, in fact, the last evidence session we had when I was chair of the DCMS Select Committee was with PayPal, who said, well, if people are making foreign donations illegally into election campaigns, well, it's not our responsibility to check. It's up to the people that receive the money. And that seems to be a big problem too, that it's not really clear what the role and accountability of the tech companies is to monitor what goes on their platforms.
Yes, it's absolutely correct. And with what we've touched on as well is that the rules that are in place are so easy to get around. It's frightening. I mean, the multiple donations coming from multiple sources, which in fact could have started with one person. These are fig leaves. They're not real. They're not really serious attempts to prevent foreign donations into political parties.
And these are the sorts of things that the tech companies could easily spot, in that if someone is making a donation from one country to a campaign in another country, a platform should easily be able to identify that, and that should raise a flag within that company that would see that transaction referred to the Electoral Commission or some other authority. These are the sorts of rules that are in place in banking to detect fraudulent activity, but there seems to be no requirement that they take place in our democratic life.
Well, I think it's absolutely true. What happened, I think, probably after the financial crash, all sorts of perfectly good thinking was done about how to protect the financial systems, and hardly any of that thinking's been has found itself reading across into our political systems. And the greater danger, and we pointed this out a number of times in the report, is this news creeps out, and all it does with the electorate is create cynicism. The electorate almost no longer expect it to be straight. They expect, all the expectations certainly that my parents would have had of the electoral system and going to vote and putting their mark on things, have in a sense been badly undermined. And this is my own personal concern, is that we're doing very, very little to protect our own concept of fair elections, and actually allowing doubt to be seeded. And this, of course, is a real big danger with for example, the Russians. The Russians only have to seed doubt. They don't have to prove anything or change anything. They just got to make us question our own authenticity.
And that's absolutely right. And but that doubt and confusion undermines people's confidence and trust in public information and information that what's now referred to as the mainstream media publishes, and that can be very damaging. And I think, particularly during the coronavirus, we've seen that now in the context of a public health emergency, where disinformation on social media is, seeking to persuade people that 5G is the cause. 5G mobile signals has caused the virus, or seeking to promote a treatment as being a way of protecting yourself from the virus, or indeed, warning you not to take a vaccine if it's developed. And there are real world consequences to this disinformation, either in influencing elections or influencing what people think about a public health emergency.
Very, very much so. I listened to Dr. Fauci on the Radio 4 this morning on the Today program. I thought he was really good, particularly the last question, which was about the impact of social media companies. And the point he made is this has never happened in history before, where misinformation had circulated so quickly and so widely that the way he put it was that science is on the back foot. The disbelief or the lack of confidence in science is something which is being undermined every day.
Absolutely, and I think we've seen that in some of the research that's been done. Because one of the questions sometimes people put up is, well, there may be lots of disinformation on Facebook, but do people really believe it? But the research is showing that about a third of people believe that the virus was created in a laboratory. It's not an organic virus. And there's been other research showing that people that have been exposed to disinformation are less likely to follow the lockdown guidelines, more likely to question whether taking a vaccine, if it's available, will be the right thing to do. It is genuinely affecting the way people think and respond to something like coronavirus.
Well, I'm sure you had the same experience, but I think just about every piece of neutral evidence we took during the 9 months of taking evidence for our committee indicated that things were actually worse, that it were more people than you expected, and the damage was greater than you expected in terms of the spread of misinformation. There was no one that saw, actually one person, but this was in relation to Russia, suggested that maybe we were overreacting. But in every other respect, the situation is worse than people imagine.
Yeah. Now, I have to ask this as a kind of someone who's chaired a select committee taking evidence from the tech companies, something I've done many times. How did you find the experience of engaging with the big tech companies during your inquiry?
Pretty underwhelming, actually. Even at the very top with Vince Cerf, who's a very nice man and was obviously extremely practiced at doing this. His suggestion that we had nothing to worry about because good old-fashioned competition would solve all these problems over time was ingenuous. And he's a nice man. It was utterly ingenuous. And the other thing we felt is that all the people we took evidence from were over-rehearsed. There weren't very many moments of genuine candor or even questioning some of their own assertions.
And I think as well, they give the impression that they're on top of this problem, and that the problem may not be as bad as you think it is, and that they're dealing with it, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, I mean, that's what that came over time and time again. And when there is a tricky one, what they tend to say is, we will come back to you on that. It's a very interesting point. We'll come back to you. Well, we never heard again.
Yeah.
That's not quite true, actually. Facebook did come back, but they didn't come back with anything of substance. So we didn't change a word of what we'd already written, because there was nothing they were offering that was new and informative.
No, absolutely right. I think one of the yes, you often get told we've got systems in place. Is often we're told if you raise a difficult issue that suggests that they're dealing with it. But do you think the kind of at the heart of this though is a lack of responsibility, in the sense that they are not liable for this? There's no legal liability or responsibility to be placed on them. They have largely become a law unto themselves.
I do. And I've read, like you, I've read endless amount of stuff in the past year. So I start from the point of view that these are not inherently bad people. There's no kind of Frankenstein monster sitting behind this, trying to control the world. What there is a group of people who started businesses with a business model that they never really expected to work the way it has. And they literally don't know quite how to unhook it, but protect the profitability of the business model. That's the hook they're on. They've got an extraordinary business model which delivers amazing revenues, and actually to begin to address the problems it causes may end up undermining and possibly even destroying their business model. They don't know how to do that.
Now, I think one of the points that was made very strongly in your report, so I completely agreed with, I think goes to the heart of the business model, and that is the way that the algorithm promotes content. Because without that algorithm, a lot of what people say on Facebook would reach very few people. But it's the fact the algorithm promotes that and recommends that content and pushes it to people that makes it so dangerous. And within that, the inherent problem that the algorithm seems to have a preference for more extreme forms of content and speech.
Yes, it does. There's an interesting thing. They have a figure that they use of 5,000 influencers as being important. What we're suggesting is that the freedom of speech defense that they've been applying for a long time can be dealt with quite easily. That's to say, what 5,000, up to 5,000 people feel, even if it's utterly objectionable, is not going to change the world. It's when it suddenly spreads from 5,000 to 1 million, things go wrong. So we're really talking about the issue being reach, not speech. It's a rather glib phrase, but it's true. So we're trying to get rid of this either or, trying to deal with the freedom of speech ultras, as I think of them, and say, look, we're not trying to stop that. We're trying to stop the algorithmic volume raising, the algorithmic amplification of things which in themselves are probably unacceptable.
I think this is a really important point, and I've always I think for me it demonstrates one of the problems that we have from a kind of regulatory point of view, in that we still seem to regard the internet as a discrete thing, which sits outside of regulation. Whereas when we look at broadcasting, over many years we've recognised that the power to be able to reach people in their homes with news and information through radio or television is it is a great power, and therefore with that should come responsibility. And we've created codes of conduct and practice and regulatory models to oversee the way that power is exercised. But someone reaching a larger audience through social media isn't regarded as having any particular responsibility at all. And I could probably reach, an influencer could reach a bigger audience through YouTube than they probably could through a community radio station. But you've got to have a license to use one, but for the other, you don't. It's really down to you. And do you think this is inherently part of the problem, that we should focus on the size of audiences rather than the media that's used to reach them?
Very, very much so. And I'll tell you what really drove it home. I don't know if you've seen the HBO program on misinformation. It's now on Sky. It came up a while ago in the US. There's a shattering statistic in it, and I have no way of checking it, and maybe you can, that Alex Jones, during the 8 years that he was operating on multi-platforms as InfoWars, was recommended, are you ready for this, 15 billion times. 15 billion, not million, billion times. Now, this, none of the social media companies can claim no responsibility for that phenomenon. And it's at that point that this thing goes nuts. That's never happened in the history of the world, that a nutcase with conspiracy theories is amplifies to that degree. And that is, for me, the essential and quite terrifying ramification of irresponsibility by the social media companies.
Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I think I want to talk about as well is, because there's organic posting and reaching, which can be driven through to big audiences through Facebook's algorithms. There's also political advertising and targeting of people to receive those. Now, many people will know of your work as a film producer before you went to the House of Lords, but obviously before that you worked in the advertising business. And of course, some people say to me, and of course I was advertising at M&C Saatchi, that there's always been targeting of audiences in advertising, and that's true, but in a very blunt way. But the idea of micro-targeting people based on their innermost thoughts and feelings and fears and pushing political messaging at them in that way, that's something entirely new that's come out of the era of social media. And I think it's right to question whether that is responsible use of technology when people are having maybe extreme opinions and information pushed at them through these ad targeting tools.
Well, it's really interesting. Now, I don't know whether I'm sort of mea culpa here. So, yeah, I had I thoroughly enjoyed advertising. I thought it was for me, a tremendous training ground. I was responsible for a campaign in 1964, believe it or not. I don't know how many people are still alive that remember it, for knitwear. It was actually Acrolan knitwear, and we did a campaign looking at what women felt like when they first took a sweater home. And we did some beautiful photography of women trying on their sweater for the first time. In many cases, not buttoning it up, one thing or another. Ads were in the end pretty sexy, but they were very intimate, and they were really playing to, we know what this moment is when you first slip on that brand new piece of cashmere or wool or whatever it might have been. And so we were, what am I saying, Damian? I'm saying that we were delving into that area, not in a micro-targeted way, but we were looking at what people's private feelings were. We did an ad for Whitbread that became very famous, of a butler stealing some beer. So we were playing around with what people's more intimate feelings were. We escaped from, this is the point, I think the early 60s, we escaped from the ads that just had flashing prices or, this week, one time only. We did invent a different type of advertising, which has been taken to its ultimate conclusion, if you like, in micro-targeting. So I put my hand up. I was around at the time when we'd actually started thinking, well, what are people's secret desires and how do we get into them? How do we get to them? We never dreamt for a moment that we could literally individually target them.
No, but I suppose my question is politics different? Should it be different in that if I say I have a Facebook account and I choose on that account not to say what my political opinions are, but Facebook can nevertheless guess what they are and can sell that information to an advertiser. Is that appropriate?
I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that. What I do think we did, and I'm very pleased with, is I think we've resurrected Nolan. Did you see that in the report several times?
Yeah.
What we've really said is if you work in the public sphere or if you operate in a company, as far as I can say, the social media companies do, that affects the public sphere, there are a set of 7 principles which in a sense you should feel yourself signed up to. Now, what's wonderful is when you try those principles out on any individual, say, oh yeah, that's the way, that's me. You then say, well, really? I mean, so when you go and make a statement to the press as a politician, or when you deal as a civil servant, are you really applying those 7 principles? Well, the answer is honestly not. And I think we did everyone a favor by reminding them that 25 years ago, the Nolan principles were invented because politics after cash for questions was in such a lamentable state.
I think one of the most important things in I think reforming politics since then has been greater transparency, greater accountability. And when we look at the issues that affect the big tech companies, I think one of the problems has been the lack of transparency and accountability. And I'd be interested to do your views on how we should achieve that. Do you think we should go down the route of having independent regulators, or should we have independent audit conducted by sort of universities, other academic institutions that can go in and check what's going on inside the social media companies, maybe have access to information and evidence that couldn't be published because it's commercially sensitive, but nevertheless should be checked?
Well, I think the answer is it's a twin track, isn't it? We've certainly got to give regulators, be it Ofcom, be it the ICO, the powers to actually do their job properly, and indeed the sanctions and to be able to haul miscreants up and hurt them, and hurt them either reputationally or hurt them in the pocket. I think that's an essential. But this is the issue of research is so sort of fundamental that we live in a world where if you don't allow access for independent research, what are you hiding? What is it that you're uncomfortable with? Because you're quite right. You can do it in dark rooms. That research doesn't have to be published, but you do need to know that trusted researchers have given you a clean bill of health. And if they won't do that, that immediately makes them, to me, suspect.
Yes, absolutely. As final question before we bring in Charles Creel to the discussion is: you took evidence from government ministers as part of the inquiry. The government is committed to introducing its online harms bill and the response to the online harms white paper. To me, this feels like it's been a very long road because it's 2 years this summer since the DC Messelet Committee published its interim report on disinformation. And it feels like there's been a lot of discussion since then from the government, but no real concrete solutions. And were you reassured during your evidence sessions that you think the online harms bill is imminent and will contain the provisions that it needs to contain?
No. And I wish I could. I'd say that with real regret. Here's the way I see it. we were dealing with some issues in 2016-17, and you'll remember them actually, where we had some quite difficult meetings with Karen Bradley at the time, and where she was good in that she understood that there was no point in dealing with these particular issues singly, and that's when the first discussions about an online harms bill occurred, certainly with officials. I remember it very, very well. That was then picked up by Jeremy Wright, who I had several meetings with, who I think was utterly sincere about seeing this as a big legacy bill, an important bill, and he got it. Some of the most impressive meetings I ever had with the minister, actually, were with Jeremy over this bill. Now, we took evidence from Caroline Dinich, who sort of inherited responsibility. And I think she's a nice woman. And if you look at her evidence is fine, except you've got the strong sense that she's being absolutely rugby tackled on this. So what we got out of her was no commitment that the bill would come forward before 2023, and she even said 2024. And the only line I'm pleased with that I've used this week was, in the tech world, 6 and 7 years for a piece of legislation is 2 lifetimes. The tech world would have changed twice radically in those 7 years. So it's a kind of nonsense. So instead of the government beginning to catch up with the tech business, what's actually happening is the gap between what the tech business is doing and what the government are regulating or legislating for is widening literally by the month. And I've always felt sorry for Caroline. I didn't know she'd been told to play the role she played. She couldn't have been nicer and she couldn't have been more positive. But quite clearly she'd been told, slow this down.
Well, that's very concerning. Charles, it's great to have you with us, as always, for the podcast.
Thanks, Damian.
You've been listening into what we've been discussing, and what else have you been looking at in the last few days?
Well, having quite a look at Facebook this week, actually, and Cambridge Analytica, oddly, a bit of panic swept around the internet because it looked like Cambridge Analytica was rearing its head again. Carol Cadwalader, the journalist inextricably connected to them for her work, she tweeted an "Oh my God" with a video that was seeking out Facebook whistleblowers. But what really set off the panic was that the post was from an account called Cambridge Analytica. In this tweet, there's a video which opens with the Cambridge Analytica logo. It then cuts to the Cambridge Analytica Facebook page and a post from them that says, "We're back. You thought the last election was bad. You ain't seen nothing yet." And then what follows in this video is a sequence of intercut images between Mark Zuckerberg testifying to Congress and some of the worst actions of policing and worst actions from white supremacists during the Black Lives Matter protests. They then cut to a screen grab of the Donald Trump tweet, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." And then a series of title slides claim that Zuckerberg's on the wrong side of history, and they call for Facebook employees to turn whistleblower. They say, "Stand up, speak up, walk out," which for some relatively new employees at Facebook, no names mentioned, might be a big ask if you're pulling down $1 million+ bonuses. So what's Cambridge Analytica up to here then? Well, nothing really, although the players are still out there. I've seen reliable evidence that Alexander Nix is now working in the medical marijuana industry, but that's for another show. What's actually going on with this Cambridge Analytica branded tweet is that it came from an account with the @handle Detox Facebook. And it's a new activist Twitter account pushing major advertisers to stop advertising on Facebook unless it takes action against Trump. In another video, Detox Facebook lists major companies that advertise on Facebook along with their Twitter handles, and that includes Google, Coca-Cola, Nike, Lego, Disney, Nestle, McDonald's, Ford. Well, as of about an hour ago, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, and Ben & Jerry's ice cream are just 3 of more than 400 brands that are boycotting advertising on Facebook, specifically around hate speech. Also, there's Unilever, Adidas, Diageo, Reebok, Patagonia, Levi's. They're all participating, and Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have got involved as well. Now, I have some questions about whether this boycott will have an effect. The top 100 brands on the platform accounted for only about 6% of the company's revenue last year, which was $70 billion. And normally, I'd say no company can survive a 6% hit. But after the past 4 months, nothing surprises me anymore, and companies have turned out to be surprisingly resilient. However, 6% might make a difference to their investors.
Charles, what about the view of the investors in the company itself? Are any of them embarrassed or beginning to show signs of unease?
Well, I think that we've seen some investors, and like Roger McNamee, who was a very early influence on Mark Zuckerberg, have now come out and not walked away from Facebook, but walked away from their involvement with it and the direction that it's gone in, and have become quite vocal about it. And I think that's really important.
It is. One thing I picked up, there's a guy, I hadn't met him, called Kaplan, who's quite close to Zuckerberg, and I think actually probably is Nick Clegg's boss, effectively, who used to work for George Bush. And his view, it's an interesting one, his view is that the natural drift, if you like, of social media is to the left, is liberal in his is liberal. Therefore, all they're trying to do is create a corrective to keep, as it were, keep the ship steady and not allow it to drift left. Is there any, does that ring any bells?
Well, I think it's an interesting perspective. I'm not sure how much I would buy that. The fundamental philosophy of the CEOs of Silicon Valley tends toward libertarianism. And this belief in America Inc. and that the market can solve everything. But I would also argue that the fundamental philosophy of most of the employees might be toward the left. Those two things in themselves might balance themselves out, except that I also view most companies as being an extension of the personality of the people in the C-suite.
Well, interesting enough, I mentioned earlier to Damian that we took evidence from Vint Cerf, who's sort of a man I respect enormously, and his background is quite liberal, but his absolute belief in the power of competition to sort out all these issues and emerge with what he called a clean web was kind of crazy, and it was extraordinarily complacent.
It's interesting. We've gone at these investigations and these conversations about disinformation and about technology, but where they seem to end up is around conversations about the very fundamentals of our society, including how capital works.
Yeah, I think it's this interesting thing, which you won't know, but it might interest you. So in 2003, by fluke, I chaired the scrutiny committee on the communications bill. We were not allowed in that bill, 2003, to even mention the digital world. It was regarded by the Blair government as being unregulatable. We literally weren't allowed to. And then we were also told that if we did anything, it was only going to stultify innovation. That was the other thing that was trotted out. Well, when I look back, it's an extraordinary misjudgment 17 years ago.
I think innovation has become a euphemism for profit. But it's also no accident that the great metaphor for the internet has been the frontier and the cowboy.
Yeah, but when the communications bill was going through Parliament, did people really think that we'd be in a world now where YouTube is the third most watched broadcast channel in the UK, in fact by audience in terms of minutes per day that people watch it, and that the internet would start to dominate as a media platform and dominate the traditional media?
I don't think so at all. There were a number of conversations. They're all in Hansard, happily. Stephen Carter was pretty smart. David Curry was very, very nervous about the internet and about citizen power. And if you remember, we had an enormous battle over having the word citizen in the legislation at all. He wanted it to be about a consumer. He wanted it to be a consumer bill, not a citizens' rights bill.
Yeah, but I think we can see now that this is not just about consumer choice. It's about the way the internet is affecting every area of our lives. And in the context of speech, if anything, it seems that because the algorithmic bias is towards the more extreme, the more sensational, that the internet is playing a role in radicalizing political opinion rather than bringing communities together.
Absolutely. And yet when you talk to the communities themselves, the thing they tend to be most terrified of is the radicalization of communities. There's an extraordinary paradox here.
Yeah. Just before we close, Charles mentioned Cambridge Analytica and brings back the sort of spectre of the 2016 election in America. Do you feel that enough has changed to stop the sort of abuses we saw 4 years ago happening again?
Only in the sense that I think cynicism's that much more powerful, and so the notion that people just don't believe anything is beginning to quite seriously take hold. I think there was a recent poll said 57% of people believe nothing they read about politics. Now that's not great for democracy. That's not very encouraging. So I think there may be just greater cynicism. On the other hand, I'm absolutely certain that whoever the Russian trolls, whoever was operating in 2016, are a damn sight more sophisticated now, and we might see forms of attack or forms of undermining faith in democracy that we hadn't even imagined possible.
But as you say, I mean, if their work has helped get us to a position where people don't know what to believe or who to believe and don't trust anyone, then in some ways, sadly, they've already had quite a big success.
Yeah, I think they've had an incredible the success they had is 4 years of the worst president certainly in my lifetime. I think the best news is that Trump, I do genuinely believe, is losing it. And whereas I think if he was prepared to be more subtle and probably better advised, there may be bigger problems. I think he's into self-destruct mode now, or maybe I'm just being wishful. Maybe just wishful thinking.
And just one final question before we finish is the one thing we've talked about on this podcast before is the potential for deep fake films to interfere in politics and in elections. We saw a deep fake film of Nancy Pelosi last year suggesting that she was incapable at a press conference, but we've not yet seen them during this election. Do you feel this is a kind of special new category of content that there urgently needs to be some rules around?
Yeah, and I've talked to people involved in the technology, and their concern is that stuff that 5 years ago, was extremely expensive and you needed to be very, very well equipped and technically savvy to do is now relatively simple. So the ability to create deep fakes is far cheaper and far more accessible for people. That's a real worry. But there's a wonderful moment in this documentary I mentioned to you, the HBO documentary, where they're interviewing a guy in a gun shop. I guess he's the owner of the gun shop. And he's ranting about Emma Gonzalez. Remember Emma Gonzalez tearing up the Constitution on a video. They then show him that actually it's a fake video. She wasn't tearing up the Constitution at all. It's a complete fake video. He then goes nuts and says, if I could get hold of the person who created that fake, I'd kill him, whereas I was only upset with Emma Gonzalez. So here's a guy from the South, gun store owner, who once he's shown the level of that he's been manipulated, is livid about being manipulated. It's a very interesting moment. I'm going to actually try and get hold of it and extract that clip, because it's amazing. It's an amazing moment.
Absolutely, we'll must look out for that as well.
Good documentary. It's well worth looking at. I think it's called Deep Fake or Misinformation. It's excellent. What they do is they take each of the incidences, like the pizza parlor, the stuff, and just really investigate. I think they investigate 6 different instances as to where misinformation and malinformation has been very, very damaging.
Very good. We'll look out for that. David, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you.
Great pleasure.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, and featuring David Puttnam and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you. Until next time.